Hi, class. Welcome to week number 3. Thank you so much for all your participation, for your questions, and for your time responding to other people. This week, we are going to start thinking about the field. And in comparison with last week, we spent some time with really generative questions. What does the ethnography researcher attend to? How do we position ourselves in relation to what we observe? And what does it mean to write with accountability about what we see? So, those were not just intellectual exercises, they were preparing you for these weeks and for this moment. So, because this week we are going to start reflecting and we are going to start doing. So, this week, my friends, you are entering the field. And now, I want to be honest with you that the phrase feel is one that we are going to complicate this week because it turns out it is not as self evident as it sounds. And that complication is actually one of the most important things the readings ask us to sit with. So let's start with Mills and Morton because I think their chapter is the best entry point for this week. They open by asking us to think historically about where the concept of the field comes from. And what they show us is uncomfortable. The idea of going into the field was born inside colonial anthropology. Early ethnographers gained access to communities in Africa, Asia, and the Americas because of colonial infrastructure made that access possible. So the field, in other words, was never a neutral place. It was a political construction. So now you might be thinking, but I'm not doing colonial anthropology. I'm studying a school, a community, an organization, a classroom, and that's true. But Mills and Morton points is that the assumption embedded in the field that it is out there, bounded, waiting to be discovered, did not disappear when the ethnographers came home and started studying their own societies. So, Mills and Morton ask us instead to think about the field as something we construct, something shaped by our research questions, our relationships, and crucially, our own position in the social world. And that is a harder thing to hold than a field in the literal sense, but it is a more honest one. So Heath and Street pick up a related thread when they remind us that nobody enters the field as a tabula rasa or a blank slate. We study something, they said, because we already know something. And this week you're beginning to read Shirley Bryce Heath's Ways with Words, and her prologue is one of the most instructive pieces of ethnography self-disclosure I know. So she tells us that she's white, that she grew up near black families in rural North Carolina, and that she entered Tracton and Rowville through personal connections, and that those connections ease her transition into both communities. And I want you to read that carefully, not to critique Heath, but to learn from what she names and what she does not name. She describes her dual role as ethnographer and teacher trainer. And she talks about the distinction between being an ethnographer learning and an ethnographer doing. And she takes responsibility for her roles as a broker between the communities she studies and the outside world. That word, broker, is worth sitting with because it names something real about what ethnographers do. We translate, we represent, we carry knowledge across contexts. And every one of those acts involves choices. Choices about whose knowledge, in whose voice, and toward what ends. Heath and Street also give us something very practical this week, the concept of co occurrence. The idea is simple but powerful. Instead of asking why something happens, the ethnographer asks what else is happening at the same time. What patterns emerge when you look at time, space, and interaction together? So I will come back to that in a moment because it is exactly what I want you to practice this week. So here is what I'm asking you to do. When I was teaching English in Malta, a small Mediterranean island, I used to take my students out of the classroom and into public spaces to observe how Maltese people actually communicated. Malta, it's loud, warm, direct, and spontaneous. My students, many who came from, let's call it more reserved culture contexts, were fascinated. And what struck me was how much more they learned from that 1 hour of observation than from any formal lesson I have planned ever. So what I noticed is that they didn't just pick up vocabulary. They pick up gestures, rhythms, and confidence. And they saw language as something alive in the world, not something confined to a textbook. And I want you to have a version of that experience this week. So, what I'm asking you is to go to a public space, a cafe, a metro station, a town square, the airport lounge, and observe smartphone behavior. Who uses their phone, how and when, and what is happening alongside the phone use, and what does the space itself tell you about how people are relating to each other. So we are paying attention to how people are socializing in these days in public space, and how digital the digital interface is part of that negotiation. As you observe, I would like you to bring the readings with you. Try applying Heath and Street's concepts of co-occurrence. Notice what your own position in the space makes visible or invisible to you. And think about what Mills and Morton mean when they say research relationships are first and foremost social relationships. Even in this brief observation, you are already negotiating your presence. So then ask yourself one more question. Why did you choose this space? And what does that choice reveal about your own assumptions going in? So you don't need to answer all those questions in your post. Choose the one or two that felt more or most alive in your observation and let those drive your reflection. In about 300, 400 tops words and posted on the discussion board. And this is a precursor to your official fieldwork assignment, which I will post next week. So treat it as practice, but take it seriously. The habits of attention you build here really matter for what is yet to come. So I want to close by naming something I think is easy to miss in the readings of this week. Heath and Street describe ethnography research as inherently interpretative, subjective, and partial. Mills and Morton remind us that ethical clearance does not resolve the harder questions of representation and accountability. And Heath herself, in the prologue, writes that she took responsibility for the influence of her ideas, her presence, and her role as a broker. What all the three of these tests are pointing toward is the same thing. The ethnographer is never outside the situation they are studying. I learned this in a very direct way during my own dissertation defense and my own dissertation dissemination, and I keep thinking about it. So, two of my members of my committee pushed back on something that I have not fully reckoned with, that my presence among the teachers I study, the teachers that you see in this picture, had ripple effects on how they understood their own identities and practices. And I have introduced them to concepts and frameworks they were not familiar with. I had helped them name collected practices that had always been there but were never articulated or recognized by them. In other words, I was no neutral observer. I was part of what was happening. And in that moment, during my dissertation defense, I did not fully understand what they were asking me to see. But after sitting with it, I realized it was not an indictment. It was a description of what ethnography research actually is. You are in it. So your presence changes it. And that is not a problem to solve. It is a condition to work with honestly and carefully every time you enter the field. And that is what this week's observation is asking you to practice. No perfection, just honest and intense attention. So I look forward to reading your reflections and how the exercise went. And I want to see that on the discussion board. Have a great week, everyone. Bye, class.